Hi again. Today we are going to talk about managing people in international organizations. Honestly, this is my favorite topic. We talked about international trade, we talked about immigration, we talked about political systems. All of those are interesting topics. But in the end, it all boils down to managing people, basically to cross-cultural psychology. And so this is what we're going to talk about today. So when you have people from different cultural backgrounds, how do you make them work together more effectively? How do you create a system in which people can fully realize their potential in cross-cultural situations? Now, I'm going to start with a number of simple, kind of reasonable questions related to managing people in cross-cultural context. For example, let's talk about expatriation. Let's imagine that you want to open a company, let's say, for example, from America in China. You're an American company, assuming, and you want to open a business in China. One of the questions you will have to answer is, where will the employees come from? Are you going to send Americans to China? Are you going to hire Chinese? Are you going to hire third country nationals, maybe people from Australia? What would be the best strategy and why? Or vice versa. Imagine that a Chinese company is trying to open a business in the United States. Should they send their own employees from China to the United States? Should they hire Americans? Or maybe they should hire someone from Europe and send them to the United States. Those are all very good questions, and there are very good answers to those questions. So we're going to talk about all of those issues in the first half of the lecture. So first, expatriation. Now, before we get into the all the details, what and where works, let's first discuss the factors that probably will determine your decision. So whether you're going to send expatriates or whether you're going to use locals may depend on a number of things. And it depends on whether, for example, you need some special expertise, right? So what if you don't have anyone local who knows enough about the company or the product? In that case, obviously, you'll have to use expatriates. What is the nature of the task? Is it something general that anyone can do, or is it something specific that only people with experience in your company can do? Cost, wages, are locals expensive? Are locals cheap? Benefits that you have to provide according to the law. Relocation cost, how expensive is it to send an expatriate? Training cost, turnover cost, legal, taxes, support, all that kind of stuff. So all those play a huge role. So let me, for example, give you one specific case of differences in wages. And we can talk about, for example, that an employee in the United States costs you anywhere between $15 to $200 an hour, depending on qualifications, whereas an employee in China costs you anywhere between 50 cents and $5 an hour. So there is a huge difference. But there is another way to take a look at how much different people cost you in different countries, and this one kind of adjusts for cost of living. And so here you have a graph that shows you how many minutes on average an employee should work in a given country or a city to earn a Big Mac. So when you look, for example, at Nairobi, it will take 3 hours to earn a Big Mac. In Kiev, Ukraine, it takes about an hour and a half. In Tokyo, it takes only 10 minutes. So as you can see, there is a huge difference in the cost of employees. And so it may, to a large extent, determine whom you're going to use. If you are in the United States and you are going to China, it is much cheaper to hire Chinese employees, because if you're going to send an American to China, it will cost you extra because you'll have to pay an American wage. But this is only one of many, many factors that we are going to discuss. So, for example, minimum wage. If this is a managerial position where you have to pay a lot of money, that's one thing. But what about factory workers? What about people who basically work at the minimum wage? Well, here you have a graph that shows what the minimum wages are in different parts of the world. And as you can see, there are quite a lot of differences. So, for example, in Europe, there are countries where the minimum wage could be as high as $10 an hour, like in Luxembourg or France, and as low as only $3 an hour, like, for example, in Czech Republic. Same thing, for example, in Asia. You have places like, for example, Japan or South Korea, where minimum wage is about $6 or $5, and you have China, where there is seems to be no minimum wage at all. So there are huge differences. Then you also should keep in mind that minimum wages are increasing in some countries all the time. For example, many European countries are now increasing their minimum wages. The United States is talking about making the federally mandated minimum wage $10.30, if I remember correctly. So there are huge differences, and those determine your choices. My favorite comparison is the United States with $7.25 federal, and many states have much higher minimum wages. There are some states where the minimum wage is at $12. LA literally just a week passed a law that makes $10.50, I believe, the minimum wage. And then just across the border, you have Mexico, where it's only 80 cents per hour, the minimum wage. So the huge difference, 1 to 10, right? Now, so when you will make those choices, you will basically have three basic choices. One, you can use what we call ethnocentric staffing. Ethnocentric staffing, that's when you send expatriates. That's when you send an American from America to, for example, work in China. Then you have the other option. We'll talk about them one by one. So let's talk about expatriates. Pause here and for a second think. What would be the advantages of sending an employee from your own country to a different country where you're trying to open a subsidiary? So what would be the advantages and disadvantages? Can you think about them? I strongly encourage you to pause here, and before I tell you my reasons, think what you can think about. And so clearly you have a number of advantages. One, and that's a huge one, tight control over subsidiaries. So you have your business, let's say in the United States or whatever country you are in, and you want to open a subsidiary somewhere overseas. You want to have that subsidiary under control. And the problem is that if you hire a local, you may not be able to trust that person. You may not be able to communicate with that person effectively. A different culture, you don't really know that person. That person may not know much about your own business, so the person may not quite follow your directions, or perhaps have the knowledge, company-specific knowledge, to follow your directions. In many cases, especially when you have a classic example of a Western company expanding into a developing country, you may not have expertise locally. So for example, let's say you need managers to run the subsidiary. Maybe you don't mind hiring locals, but maybe you just cannot find anyone who is qualified. When we talk about China or maybe Eastern Europe, there are more and more people from those countries going to study in Western Europe, in North America. And so there are some people who may have the education, but still finding someone who is fully prepared to run your business may not be an easy task. Also sometimes, and this is very important, kind of, a little taboo topic, but it's very important. Sometimes you want to create an image of your company that signals that it's a Western company. It is the case, unfortunately or luckily, I don't know how you want to define it, that in, for example, some Asian countries, some Latin American countries, African countries, even in Eastern Europe, the countries can be corrupt, have a high level of corruption. Some are even failed states. Locals kind of don't trust locals. They know that fraud, that cutting corners are very common, ubiquitous. And so when people see let's say American company or German company or Japanese company, they trust those companies more. They think that, well, maybe those people brought those institutional values, practices of being, a company that works in a country with strong institutional tradition. And so people may have more trust in, let's say, an American or Japanese or German company. And given a choice, they would go to a foreign company just because they think they will offer better quality of service or products. And if this is your case, if let's say you go from Japan or from Germany, let's say to Ukraine or maybe to Zambia, right? Sometimes you want to emphasize your foreign origin. You want your customers to see you as a Western company with a respected reputation, a company from a country where fraud or malpractices are not common. In that case, you might want to send expatriates just because it's easy to see that it's a Western company. It's not only the label on the door, they actually have Germans or Americans or Japanese or whatever the country, Australians working for that company. And if that's the case, yes, it may be worthwhile taking the extra expense of sending expatriates. Finally, you may want the interest of your company protected by using expatriates. Because if you hire a local, there is always a chance that that person will not only not identify with your company, but maybe also will have the interest of his or her country at the top of his priority list, or maybe some sort of personal interests. So there are all kinds of reasons why people may not put your company first. When you send an expatriate, there is a very good chance that person will be devoted, will be committed to your company first, and that's what you want. So again, it may cost you extra, but may give you that extra control, extra peace of mind, extra oversight over the company. However, there are very big disadvantages of using expatriates, and the biggest one is expensive. Sending an expatriate to a foreign country is extremely, extremely expensive. And I'll give you some numbers in a minute. The other reason could be that sometimes you don't want to create an image of a foreign company. Most countries are patriotic and they feel good about buying local. Canada, even Ukraine, my native country, people kind of feel patriotic when they buy local. And so when the company is obviously a foreign one, people may feel like they're betraying, like they're taking the jobs from their own countrymen and giving them to someone overseas. So sometimes that may be a problem if you use expatriates, because everybody sees right away that the company is a foreign one. And some people may say, oh, they're exploiting us, see, we're working for them. Now back to the money. Relocating an employee is extremely expensive. There is so much that goes into relocating an employee. It seems like it's easy. You just buy the air tickets and boom, done. No, there is much more. In fact, for a managerial level worker, but also the same applies pretty much to all levels, it can easily cost 2 to 3 annual salaries, just the relocation part. So you literally can easily pay $200,000 to $500,000 for the whole enterprise to send an employee to a foreign company. And this is why it costs so much. It's much more than just the boxes, just packing stuff and put it on the airplane. You have to provide pre-project training, right? So in many cases that takes a lot of money, a lot of time. Housing, if you send an employee overseas, you have to pay for the housing. If you hire a local, the person normally is expected to have a place to live. An expatriate sent to a different country, you definitely have to provide for the housing. Often transportation, often for the family, especially if the expatriate has kids, you will have to pay for the school, legal expenses, tax expenses, home visits. In most cases, you will have to pay at least for one travel, like for example, for Christmas, going home. Healthcare, often bodyguards. If you send a person to a country that is dangerous, you will have to provide for the safety. So all those things, dozens of people who will make that relocation possible, you have to pay for them. And so once you add that all up, it's a lot of money. So expatriates are expensive. So if I had to summarize it in kind of simpler terms, so why would you want to use expatriates if they're so expensive? As we said, there is a position filling, so sometimes you just need to fill the position and there is no one available locally. Control, and there was a very interesting paper by Will Harting about kind of the types of control that expatriates can exercise. I believe it was called bears, spiders, and bumblebees. And so they talked about direct control, where you literally have someone who is the boss. You have control by example. You have just a person who is there to show the locals how business is done. For example, it's a very interesting example. When the first McDonald's restaurants were opened in Russia, McDonald's literally hired people in the United States, like line employees, people who just stay at the register and basically rent you out, and send those people to Russia to work at McDonald's, so that those people could show to the locals what it makes, how it works being an employee in McDonald's. Yes, here in the United States, that's probably the lowest of the low jobs. They definitely make the minimum wage. But in Russia, without the culture of running a restaurant, fast food restaurant, American style, you literally had to export people there because the locals just didn't know how to do it. And finally, spy control. Spy control, that's not necessarily the person who will be making the decisions, who will be, directing the operations. It's just a person who sits there and kind of observes. You want to have two, eyes there that are, the eyes you can trust. And so you kind of send a person just to be there so that you have someone who can communicate with you and tell you what's going on. You might want to sometimes send expatriates for staff development purposes. You just want them to learn about that country, know better how it works there. So maybe for a year or so that when they come back to your office in New York, London, Vilnius, whatever country you are from or city you're from, you have someone here at the headquarters who were there and who know how it works and who can basically do their job better from the headquarters, having been in a foreign country for a while. Networking, again, in some countries, it's all about, whom you know. It's all about knowing the people, having the right connections. And again, sometimes you might want to send a person there for a year or two just so that they establish those connections, so they know whom to approach with questions if questions arise. And maybe even status. I mean, as I said, sometimes it's prestigious to be a foreign company. And so you want to send an expatriate so a person walks into the office, sees right away an American employee or Australian employee or Canadian employee and says, oh yeah, that's respectful. That must be a very good company. This is just a joke, sometimes expatriation seems cool, but sometimes, anyway, read the cartoon. Now, polycentric staffing, that's when you basically hire locals. So that's when you hire people from the country where you are opening a subsidiary, and they work for you. I don't know why they use those fancy terms. Couldn't they just say expatriates, locals, third country nationals? But that's what the terminology is, and you need to know it. Again, pause here for a second and think what would be the advantages and disadvantages of hiring locals. All right? And let's see if your ideas will correspond to my ideas. Well, first, advantages. Big one, it's cheaper, right? And by cheaper, I not only mean that it's cheaper per hour, but also you save on relocation. In many cases, you also save on commitment, because, if you send an expatriate for 2 years, the person has to sell his or her house. The person has to, leave everything behind. And if something doesn't work in a few months, if that person doesn't happen to be successful in that new culture, in that new country, what do? You can't just, lay off that person, because the person committed to you, the person sacrificed a lot of, comfort to work for you. So you kind of stuck. With the locals, big deal. I mean, doesn't work, just let him go, find someone else. So that's a big deal. Another big deal is that locals in many cases know more about the local business. For example, a manager who would be successful in, let's say, here in North Carolina may not and probably will not be successful in, for example, Kiev or Moscow or whatever other country, because the set of skills and competencies that are needed to run a business in Greensboro, North Carolina, for example, is a very different set of skills that is needed to run a business in Kiev. For that matter, by the way, if you take a successful manager from, let's say, Kiev or Beijing and put that person, let's say, in New York, there is a very good chance that person will fail, because it's a very different set of skills. Like, whereas here you must know, kind of everyday operation. There, it's much more about how to survive, with, government controlling you all the time, sometimes bandits, sometimes, partners that may be, kind of trickier than they are here. So those are very different sets of skills that you need to know. So also, if the country is highly patriotic, like, for example, Canada, let's say, and Canadians love Canadian companies, you might want to hire locals just so that it looks like a Canadian company. For example, in Canada, again, talking about McDonald's, when you see that, two arches, right? McDonald's arches. In Canada, you would always see the Canadian leaf right there. And so in advertisement, they would always say something like proudly owned and run by a Canadian family or something like that. And so while it's an American franchise, it's owned by Canadian, that particular restaurant is owned by Canadians and Canadians work for it. And so if that's the case, if you're trying to open something in a country where people prefer to go local, you might want to hire a local so that it looks like a local company. Now, disadvantages, well, again, potentially less control because, you don't know the locals. And even if they try, even if, they're honest, committed, everything's fine. They just may not know enough about your company, about your culture to be effective employees the way you want them to be, right? There may be some company prestige problems, as we said, and they may just not know enough about your own company and product. So it may be just, not good quality of work. Now, it's again very important to remember that locally hired managers, as well as other levels of employees, will literally cost you about 10 to 30% of your total, what it would cost to send an expatriate. And so holding everything else equal, if you happen to find someone who's qualified, obviously you're better off with going with a local. And again, the more international education or education in other countries become a popular approach, the easier it is to find those people. Just about every country in the world by now has accumulated quite a few and sometimes thousands and thousands of people with Western education. So if you happen to be an American company, Canadian, or maybe Western European, there is a good chance that just about anywhere you can find people who will be educated to your standards. Some companies, what they do is sometimes they would literally pay for the education of locals in your country. They would kind of repatriate them for like half a year, and those people spend time at your company, learn about it, sometimes even go to school here. So when they come back to their home countries, they're prepared to run those businesses. So that still may be much cheaper than sending an American, for example, to your country. Now, finally, geocentric staffing. That's when you hire a third country national. You go from, let's say, Lithuania to, let's say, China. And in that case, you may want not to hire either a Chinese or Lithuanian person, or neither Chinese nor American, whatever country you come from, but a third country national. What would be the advantages and disadvantages? Well, if you shop for talent globally, if you do not limit your candidate pool to either only your country or your country and the host country, you may potentially get better candidates. In many cases, you may save on relocation. For example, let's say you're a company from Europe or America that wants to open a subsidiary in, let's say, China, okay, or Indonesia. It may be too expensive to send an American there, and it may be difficult to find qualified personnel locally. So what many companies may do is to hire, let's say, Australians. Australia is relatively close there. I mean, it's still far away, but it's much closer than the United States. And they are equally prepared as Americans as far as education, business practices, and stuff like that. So if you have to pay for relocation and, home trips and stuff like that, you may actually want to shop around in a kind of more developed countries, which may still be giving you enough talent, but at the same time at a much lower price than someone from, let's say, the United States. Obviously, again, the challenges is that those people may not have enough knowledge about your company. It may still be costly, but that's an option. Now, there is this whole body of literature on what we call third country kids. Those are children who were born to families of mixed cultural background. For example, it's a kid who was born in the United States to the parents, one of whom is, let's say, from the United States, and the other one is from, for example, Ukraine. Or perhaps even both parents are from somewhere else, not from the United States, and both are from different countries. And so that's a third country kid because the kid was born in a country that is foreign to both of his parents, right? So in that case, you kind of get kids who are growing up in a multicultural environment. So the parents are, of one culture or perhaps of even two different cultures. The kid is growing up in a third country with yet another cultural background. Now, since those parents got married in a third country, there is a good chance they traveled. I mean, obviously they did travel, and there is a good chance they will travel more. And as a result, this kid will not only grow up in a multicultural environment, but the kid will also be used to moving. To some extent, my kids are like that. So they were born in Canada to Ukrainian parents. They now live in the United States. We moved many times. I mean, I must have changed addresses at least 12 times since the kids were born, and many more times myself. And so kids like that have some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantages, the literature shows, is that these kids, one, have an easier time adapting to new cultural environment. So one of the big challenges with expatriation is that while people feel that it's kind of cool and easy to go overseas, once they do, they find it much more difficult. I mean, it's literally a cultural shock. And believe me, it's much more difficult. It's much bigger problem that many people would imagine. Oh, sure, I would like to go and work in China for a few years. Well, try it. It's not as easy. It's much more complicated than it may seem. And so kids who grow up in multicultural environment, they have an easier time adapting to new cultures. Second, moving is not so easy psychologically. Again, if you happen to be a young person, like let's say, high school or college, you probably are okay with moving. I mean, it's fun. I mean, as I said, I left home when I was 16, and I've spent time a year in Germany, sometime in the United States, then almost another year in Germany. I've been to pretty much all European countries during that period. I went to study in Texas. I went to do my PhD in Canada, relocated again to the United States, have visited I don't know how many countries, dozens. It seems like it's a cool thing, but I'll tell you what, once you have a family, once you turn a certain age, moving is actually not that much fun anymore. Even travel is not that much fun anymore. I mean, it is a lot of fun, but it's kind of tolling. It's difficult. I mean, packing, unpacking, it takes weeks. When you have kids, school, spousal employment, your employment, all those, administrative things. It kind of becomes, how should I put it? You kind of become a little tired of it. And I know you may not believe it, but, once you've done it many, many, many times, at some point, my dream became not to move much anymore, because moving, you leave all your friends behind. You spend so much time on, packing your stuff, unpacking your stuff, looking for house, selling house, all that stuff. In addition, you lose a lot of stuff in the process because, you cannot take all of it. So it's extremely, tolling. So, and many people, while they may think that they would like to move and live somewhere for a while, once that happens, they may actually not like it that much. And again, I suspect if you're watching this lecture, you're probably kind of into the international business, and you probably think that, oh yeah, it would be cool. In fact, the reason I went into international business is because I want to travel, I want to work overseas. But wait until you actually have to do it. First, as I said, you may not enjoy it at all. Many people, in fact, most people don't enjoy it. It's, they thought they would, but they didn't. And then on top of that, once you do it many times, you may enjoy it first times. Like my first visits overseas, I loved it. I mean, best time of my life. But now if I had to relocate yet again, especially for a short period of time, like a year or two, I'm not even sure if I want to do it. I mean, it's just too much hassle. It's not even that it's hassle. I have a vibrant research program going on. I have some things that I want to accomplish. I have some projects that I want to work on. I really want to build this Wikidemics. I want to expand X-Culture. I want to do some things. And it takes a lot of time. And relocating will take several months of my life just, to make it happen. And I don't want to waste time on that. I want to make things that I'm focused on now happen, and I don't want to waste time on relocation. And so sooner or later that will happen to you. You will have some idea, you will want to do something, and travel will interfere with those plans. So unless you have nothing better to do, yes, then it's fun. Otherwise, it's not so easy. So anyway, going back to third country kids, they not only have an easier time adapting to new cultures, but they almost have this need or urge to relocate. Because growing up, they move from one place to another. They live for a few years in, let's say, for example, Canada, like my kids, sometime in Ukraine, which is not that, in the United States, which is not that different. But believe me, there is a huge difference between Canada and southern United States where we are. The difference is definitely bigger than between some, European countries. And then, obviously Ukraine a few times and stuff like that. And some of them are much, much more mixed. It could be like a family. He's from India, she's from China. They grew up in the United States. They moved 10 times because the parents were studying at different schools, then different jobs. So by the time the kids kind of hit, come of age, they've not only used to traveling, not only used to changing places every few years, but they actually developed the need to do that. And they are perfect expatriates because you can send them and they will like it and they will actually enjoy it. So the only problem with that is that research shows that they have a difficult time to maintaining relationships. So they are more likely to get a divorce than regular kind of folks. And so as a result, well, anyway, they're excellent for expatriation, but not so good for making families, if I can put it that way. Anyway, here is a question, and let's see if you know the terminology. And the answer is C, ethnocentric. And this one, hiring locals, that's a polycentric approach. And this one, worldwide search, that's geocentric. And cosmocentric and eccentric that I made up as answer options, those are made up terms. Now, what would you do? Here you have a situation where your company is opening a full-scale subsidiary in a foreign country. What staffing policy would you use? Would it matter what kind of position you're trying to fill? Would it matter what country you're moving to? Would it matter based on the nature of your business? What would be your answer? Again, let's talk about those things. Some companies, for example, do a mixed approach. For example, Microsoft uses kind of a dual approach. They would have a local who does the job, but they would also have an expatriate who works with the local. So basically double staff the key positions. And so here is a story about a guy who runs Microsoft's subsidiary in India. And so here the idea is that there would be a person, this particular guy with American education, but who is local, who knows how it works locally, who runs the subsidiary in India. But then there is also an American expatriate who works with him, who provides a better link to the parent company. And one of the reasons for that is they are kind of afraid that the person they hired locally will kind of go native and will lose, that commitment to the parent company. Now, I want to show you a short video clip that discusses, it's a documentary about a guy who went from the United States to Paris on a 2-year assignment, and he failed in a sense that he returned prematurely. And so here is an interview with the guy after his return where he discusses with his company what went wrong. He is mad, by the way. He is very, very mad. And so he explains why he is mad and so why the company failed him, but also he failed the company. And so I'm not going to put it directly in the video lecture because I think it's a copyrighted video. And if I embed it in the video lecture, the whole thing will be banned. But I'm going to post it on the website, the course's website. So if you're taking this course for credit, you will be able to watch this video. The point of this video is, one, that there is a difference between, well, let me tell you a joke and you'll understand what I'm talking about. So imagine that there is this man who dies and goes to paradise, okay? He goes to paradise, and paradise is kind of okay, everything is clean. The angels are, singing songs, and people are just walking around and enjoying themselves in the paradise. Kind of, nice. Then after living in paradise for a while, he has a vacation and he chooses to go to the hell. And so he has a basically tourist visa and goes to the hell for, 2 weeks. He comes to hell and he kind of likes it. There is a party going all the time. People are drinking beer and eating, steaks and chocolate. And, it seems to be a fun place. And so he comes back to the paradise and, applies for immigration to the hell. So he fills out his application. The God looks at the application and says, granted. You get the green card. Here is your passport or whatever, new documents. Go to hell. he goes to hell, and once he crosses the border, the devil puts him on a pan and starts frying him. And the man is in shock, and he says, well, what's going on? I was here just a few weeks ago as a tourist, and it was so wonderful. I mean, how come now it's so difficult? And the devil tells him, do not confuse tourism with immigration. And that's exactly the point with expatriation. It's one thing going to Paris for a weekend, having fun, Eiffel Tower, Louvre, all those things, versus actually immigrating there or going there for a few years. There are so many things, driver's license, housing, schooling, cultural, language, all those kinds of things. They will make your life, in many cases, much more difficult than you expected. And so here is a story, like a real story of a guy from America who went to work in Paris and it didn't work out. Watch it. It's only a few minutes, but you will love it. Now, let me talk about other issues related to expatriation. One, this is huge. When we talk about expatriation, in many cases we are stereotyping. So when we think about expatriation, we always have this mental image in our head that an expatriate is a guy from a developed country like the United States who was sent to a developing country like China to be a manager there and work there for a while. So it's a rich man from a rich country going to a poor country to be a manager. And it's not necessarily the case. I mean, it may still be the majority of expatriate assignments, but increasingly you would see people from developing countries going to developed countries. For example, in the United States, you see more and more Chinese companies doing business here and Chinese expatriates working here. Japanese companies, most of them would use Japanese expatriates. South Korea, same thing. So it's not always that kind of one type of stuff that people have in their heads. Second, going up or going down. I hope you will understand it, and it's kind of almost embarrassing to talk about that, but it's a big deal and it's an important issue. When I ask my students how many of them want to work overseas for a while, pretty much 100% of them say yes, we want to work overseas. And when I ask them where you want to go, about half of the class choose London, another 40% choose France, Paris, and then the remaining 10% would be split almost equally among like Tokyo, maybe Beijing, like kind of other cool locations, maybe Sydney, Australia, things like that. Virtually nobody wants to go to a country you've never heard of, places that are developing countries. And so same thing, by the way, applies to, like, for example, diplomats or other people who tend to have foreign assignments. In our head, we kind of have this image, going up or going down. And going up, that's going to, cool metropolitan centers like, London, Paris, Toronto, Sydney, Tokyo, maybe Beijing. And so if you happen to be sent to the middle of nowhere, somewhere in, let's say, Colombia or Africa or Ukraine, people feel like that's a demotion, like that's, you are sent, put down, not promoted up, right? At the same time, this cannot be further from the truth. The thing is that when you are sent, especially from a kind of less economically developed country, let's say, for example, to New York or to Paris, chances are your income, if you are paid by your parent company from, let's say, China or Ukraine or Lithuania, chances are that you will be relatively poor, right? I mean, an average New Yorker probably makes, I don't know, anywhere between $50,000 and $500,000. I mean, hardly anyone works for less there. It's just impossible to survive. And many people make much, much more than that. And I'm guessing, like a managerial employee in New York, $200,000 minimum and probably much more for most. And so if you are going to New York from, let's say, Ukraine, I mean, how many companies can pay you that money? Not many. I mean, they may cover your basic expenses, but you will kind of be a small fish in a big pond. And there will be lots of cool people who are much, much richer, much more prestigious, connected around you. And you will always feel like, you are an inferior person. You are not as good as they are. Now, on the other hand, if you are going to one of those developing countries like Zambia, I don't know, whatever place you think of, all of a sudden you become the cool guy. Like, for example, I'm not going to name the place, but I occasionally go to this country in Latin America. It's a relatively poor country, and it's a country that you would call a developing country. And I was very surprised to the company that I go to, how many foreign employees they have there. Many people from Europe, many people from the United States. And I would ask them, there was this, for example, one German guy that I was talking to, and I would ask him, so why did you decide to go to Colombia? I mean, you could make much more money in Germany. You could probably easily go to the United States, Canada, Australia. Your salary might be several times that level. And he says, wait a second. Over there, I would be just a guy, not any better than anybody else, maybe even, just a guy, average. Here, I'm a half king. I mean, first, coming from one of those more developed countries, everybody respects you. Everybody looks at you as, I don't want to use this stereotypical term, but, like the white person, like the old, in bad connotation person, but also, the one who is kind of higher society type of person. All of a sudden, everybody wants to be friends with you. Everybody wants to, kind of looks up to you. You have a better time, you get more respect. And on the other hand, even though my salary here is lower than it could have been in, let's say, Europe or North America, what I can buy with that salary here is much, much more. So my quality of life here is much higher. For example, I have a nanny for my kids. I have a person who cleans my house. I have a servant who cooks my food. I mean, back home in the same position, I wouldn't be able to do all that. For the money that they would pay, even if it's higher than here, I would probably rent an apartment for the rest of my life. Here I have a house, here I have people working for me, here I get all that respect. So while the country is much less developed than my home, the way I'm treated here, I would never have that same status and quality of life there that I have here. So keep that in mind when you think about expatriation, and don't get upset when you are sent to one of those developing countries, because as I said, the type of life you will get there may be much better than what you would get in some of those prestigious centers like London or Paris. Finally, family. Now this is a big deal. I should probably talk about it more, but I'll just tell you that it makes it incomparably more complicated, more challenging, more difficult when you bring your family along. Especially, if you have a family, because, even if you don't bring your family, if you leave your family behind, it's even worse, because then you miss your kids, then, your spousal relationships, distance relationships become much more complicated. So it's going to be even worse if you don't take your family. But if you bring your family with you, it's even worse. And so you will have so many problems. I'll just discuss some of them. One, chances are that the immigration regulations there will not allow your wife to work, or your spouse if you're, your husband. And so that means that there will be several big complications. One, you will have to live on one salary. So back home, your spouse could have a job and you basically have double income. Here you will probably have only one income level source, and so as a result your income level will be much lower. Second, if your spouse has to stay home, you will have problems like this. You will have different schedule, different kind of biological clock. Let me explain to you that situation using my own experience. For example, sometime in the late 90s, I spent almost a year with Volkswagen. In Köln, I was stationed a little bit in Wolfsburg, so kind of, in different places in Germany. It doesn't matter what the job was. The point is that my wife, and at that time I believe she was still my girlfriend, but anyway, she came for a visit to visit me for an extended period of time. And that was the worst time of my life. And here is the reason for that. I mean, never before we were, or never after we were so close to getting a divorce or, split and separating. The reason for that is this. I had a job that started fairly early, so I would wake up at 6 or 7 a.m. I would be at work. I believe it was actually at 7 because Germans start early and, work long hours. I would go to work, very challenging, very exhausting. You have to operate in a foreign language, in a different culture, so it's very stressful. And so you work there whole day, you come home exhausted after the work, and the only things you literally want to do, you want to maybe have dinner, watch some TV, have an intimate relationship with your wife, if you know what I mean, and just go to sleep. You're exhausted. Your spouse, on the other hand, is very different. The whole day she was sitting home doing nothing, waiting for you. She, mine happened to know the language a little bit, but again, in many cases your spouse wouldn't know the language, wouldn't have local friends. So basically he or she sits at home and just is bored, right? And just waits for you to come home and then do something together, go somewhere. And so you have this difference in interests, difference in schedule, difference in your biological preferences at that time, and that creates a conflict. I mean, that creates huge conflicts, especially if you go to some of those kind of more close societies like in the Middle East. It's very difficult to get locals as friends. In some Asian countries, like in Japan, I've heard people live there for years and years and still cannot break into the local culture. Friends that same way. And so your spouse, as I said, she has very different aspirations, everyday needs than you do. And as a result, it becomes very difficult because you're on different kind of wavelength. On top of that, if you have kids, school, adjustment, trouble, conflicts, language, grades, friends, bullying, all those things are problematic. And so it's much more difficult to survive in a foreign country when you have a family with you. So anyway, keep those in mind. There is also one thing that I didn't mention here, but that's repatriation. In many cases, when you come home after expatriation, nobody's really waiting for you. So you think that, I spent this time overseas and now I'm so much more experienced. I know something about that culture. I should be promoted. I should be given more responsibilities. I should be paid more money because I'm better than everybody else. I spent 2 years in China, for example. And you come home and nobody cares. First, your job could have been filled because, somebody should have been doing it, and so you cannot come back to your job. The priorities in 2 years could have changed, and while the company might have sent you initially because they needed someone with expertise in that country, 2 years later, who knows? They may not even do operations much there anymore. People, don't really, in many cases, see value in that. It's just like soldiers come back home from wars. They were going to combat there. They knew how to operate this vehicle, this machine gun. They come home and people say, well, who cares? Now flips the burgers or whatever they do. So the respect they expected in many cases will not be there. The raises they expected in many cases will not be there. Studies show that about 60% of all returning expatriates don't stay with their companies. They quit almost right away or within a year. Because they don't, the company didn't plan for their return, and they don't feel like they appreciate it. So that's a big issue too. Now, switching gears, let's talk about hiring people, recruitment overseas. Again, hiring people overseas is not as easy as hiring people in your own country. So let's talk about that. So the challenges that you will encounter are not necessarily challenges per se. The challenge arises from the fact that what worked for you in your home country may not work for you in the host country. For example, the same mediums may not be available for your advertisement. Like, for example, here in the United States, you would normally recruit people through internet on websites like monster.com or jobs.com. Things like that may not be available in the country where you are going. They may not even have, internet penetration high enough for people to use it as the main recruitment tool. You may have differences in how people behave in an interview, and so that may skew your assessment of their qualities and skills. Different skills, different things that you may need for the job. Let's talk about them one by one. For example, if you saw an ad like this one, would you think that it's a useful ad to recruit people? Again, read it and tell me if you think it would be a successful recruitment campaign. If you're listening to it, let me read it out for you. This is no picnic. Work in the most harsh and unimaginable conditions. Temperatures will range from 70 to 90 degrees. Mosquitoes will not, from negative 70 to positive 90 degrees. Mosquitoes will not only annoy, but will cause bodily harm. There are extensive marshes and frostbite. If you are not prepared to work under these and similar conditions, do not apply. Well, this is a real ad. Most of my students say no, it wouldn't be a good idea to use it to recruit people. But this is an ad from 1942, from June, right around the time when the United States entered the Second World War, and right around the time when the United States had the conflicts with Japan. And so they were trying to secure the oil fields in Alaska from Japanese invasion. And so they were recruiting people to work there, to develop infrastructure there. And so this is the ad that they put in the newspapers, and a record number of employees or of candidates applied for the job. It's consistently rated as one of the most successful recruitment campaigns. And so the reason it was so good is because an ad like this kind of gives you a realistic preview for the job. And if I may give you another question, think about that. Let's see if you will know the answer. If you had an absolutely perfect recruitment campaign, what would be the number of applicants per position, per opening that you would receive? So what would be your absolutely ideal scenario for the number of applications for your openings? For each opening, how many applications would you like to receive? Give me a number. Most of my students would say 20, some would say 200, some would even say 1,000. The answer is one and only one. And the reason for that is that the recruitment campaign, the purpose of a recruitment campaign is not only to attract potentially qualified candidates. The purpose of a recruitment campaign is to also repel the unqualified candidates. And so if you have a perfect recruitment campaign, it would work in such a way that it would attract a person, the absolutely best person for the job on the planet. Out of 7 billion people, one who is the best will apply. And everybody else will know from the ad, from the recruitment campaign, that he or she is not best for the job. So good that even the second best person would not apply. So this will give you the right person at the lowest expense, because a recruitment campaign, selection process takes a lot of time, and you don't want to receive a lot of applications. I was on the selection committee. We were hiring a professor last year, and I'm actually on one again this year. We received something like 200 applications for that one job. Have you ever seen 200 application packages? Like, we are talking about this much paper. Flipping through the pages will take you the whole day, and reading it carefully will take you even longer. And so you want to design your recruitment message in a way that will repel, or at least not attract, the people who are not good for the job. You want to get only a small set, or maybe even a very small set of people who are perfect for the job, and you don't want to see anybody else. And so what this job does, or job ad does, is that it gives you a realistic preview. It tells you honestly what to expect from the job, and it tells you honestly what you cannot expect from the job, like, for example, money. And so as a result, it's designed in a way that only people who are okay with this sort of arrangement would apply. So when recruiting overseas, it's very important to give a realistic job preview. It's very important to tell people what they are getting into, because overseas, that's different for you because it's a different type of job, different for employees because it's a different type of company, in many cases a foreign company. So it's very important to explain to them what you would expect, because your job will be different from a similar job offered by a local company. All right. Now, sometimes you can also get creative. Like, for example, here is a Canadian Foreign Affairs Agency ad. And so this is almost like a Peace Corps for the United States. And so here it shows you a picture of all those sheep, and it says this could be your rush hour. And again, kind of the message here is that you will have something exotic, something unusual, and potentially not much pay. And again, so the idea is that we want to attract people with this sort of mindset, people who may not be necessarily for something, like big money or big metropolitan centers. And so here is the ad, and it kind of shows you how it would work. Another very interesting technique, again, to repel their own people was used by the Fuji company some time ago, and I'm not sure if they still use it, but at some point they would set up interviews at the top of Mount Fuji. Like literally, they would say, to apply, you have to meet us on top, on the summit of this mountain. And I've been on that mountain. It's not too difficult to climb. If you are strong, you can probably do it in a few hours, right? But the idea was that people, in order to apply, would have to go, take extra steps, actually travel to that mount and actually climb it. And again, the reason for that is that many people would be applying everywhere. Like literally, they would be sending hundreds of resumes. I mean, be honest. When you are applying for jobs, or after you graduate, if you are now in college, I know you will be sending out dozens and dozens of applications. You want to apply everywhere, right? I mean, that's what we do. That's what I recommend you to do. But if the company wants to hire someone who specifically wants to work for that company, not just anyone, not just, person who applies to hundreds of companies and just waits for a offer. You want to go with the person who wants your company specifically, because this person likes your company, believes in your company, believes in your products, shares your philosophy. You want a person like that. And if that's the case, you might want to introduce those hurdles. I will interview you, but only there, and you have to climb. And so they would literally have, people like two company employees with a chair, with a table, waiting and interviewing people there. And so if the person took the trip, the person must be interested in the company. So you kind of weed out the ones who are just applying everywhere and anywhere, right? This one doesn't necessarily is international. I just found it's kind of interesting. So it's a picture from my hometown, and I like the way, how brief and yet informative this one is. So it basically says, now hiring, hands and legs $1,000, hands, legs, and head $2,500 per month. And so kind of explains right away, what they're hiring. So anyway, just something to think. Now, let's say you recruited the people, so you got the applications. How do you select the best, from the pool of recruited candidates? How do you select the one who is the best for the job? Again, this may be different from a country to country, and the methods that work in your home country may not work in other countries. For example, here in the United States, companies love to use all kinds of personality tests, aptitude tests, intelligence tests. In many cases, they would be multiple choice. And so kids who are growing up here, they know what multiple choice is. My kids are in school, like literally just started, and they already know how, multiple choice tests work. If you tried to use the same method in, for example, some other countries where there is no tradition of multiple choice testing, people may not be familiar with that, and so you may get low scores. But it's not because people are not smart enough or have their own personality, just because people are not used to this form of testing. Another problem, and this is kind of high tech, but this is particularly related to international business. I actually did some research on this topic. The thing is that people from different countries have a different, what we call, response style. For example, Americans, on a 1 to 7 point scale, when you say them, for example, how much do you like this? Or would you agree with this statement? People from the United States, for example, tend to choose what we call extreme responses. If they kind of like it, they would choose 7 on a 7 point scale. If they don't like it, they would choose 1. People from Asia, for example, tend to choose responses in the middle. So if they like it, they would say 4. If they don't like it, they would say 3 or 2. So they wouldn't go to those extremes. And that, as a result, could create an impression that there are differences in responses. So you would have some applicants from Asian cultures, some applicants from, let's say, North American cultures. You have different numbers, and you would think they're different, and you make your hiring decisions based on those numbers. But in reality, those numbers may not necessarily represent differences in personality, IQ, whatever else. They may just represent differences in response styles, right? Likewise, from some cultures, people are always saying yes, so they're much more likely to agree. We call that acquiescence bias. Again, you can have different answers, and as a result, so all those things matter. Self-promotion, for example. I'll tell you a story of my dissertation research. So a long time ago now, like 8-9 years ago, maybe even more, I was collecting the data for my dissertation. And I was looking, doesn't matter what I was looking for, work-related values, people from all around the world in Canada. Anyway, I had a number of immigrant groups in my study, and I had also Canadians as a control sample. And so one of my questions was about what we call work-life balance. And so I wanted to know, if people value their family. And there was a question something like, how important or how good as a grandchild are you? How respectful are you towards your grandparents? Something like that. And to my surprise, when I looked at the data, I noticed that Canadians were coming out on the top. They were much more respectful of the elderly, of their grandparents, than, for example, kids from India or Japan or China. And I knew that didn't make sense. I knew that in those collectivist Asian cultures, family matters more. They have more respect for seniority. They treat their grandparents with much more respect than Canadians do. And I didn't know, why? How come Canadians score higher on this scale? And then I started asking questions, and I noticed that actually it's not that simple. So you ask people, on a scale from 1 to 7, how respectful are you of your grandparents? And Canadians would choose 7. Oh, I'm extremely respectful. I visit my grandparents every Christmas. Well, maybe not every Christmas, but I try to, and at least once every few years, I visit my grandparents. I'm, solid 7. And then you ask the same question of a person from, let's say, Japan, for example, or China, how respectful are you towards your grandparents? And they would give you 3 or 4, much lower number. And you would think, oh, maybe they don't respect their grandparents. And you ask them, so why did you choose this number? And they say, well, you know what, I'm not a very good grandchild. I normally used to call my grandmother every single day, and I would visit her every weekend. But lately, I haven't called her in 2 days now, or I haven't, seen her in 2 weeks now. I'm a very bad grandchild, so therefore I'm giving myself a 3 or a 4. And so you look at those numbers, and so there is a huge difference in favor of Canadians. You ask what those numbers mean, and the whole story flips. And so that's the same thing with multiple choice regarding everything else. So the numbers that you see in your own country may be very different from the numbers that you will see in a different, cultural environment. Self-promotion is a big deal, and we kind of just talked about that, but also, again, I play this game with my students. I would ask them to write a short ad, a short passage about themselves. Let's say if they were on a dating website, meeting people, how would they introduce themselves? And so people from Asia would always say things like, although I'm not a very looking guy, I'm willing to try my best to work hard and things like that. So they're very self-effacing, modest in their, self-presentation. Americans, on the other hand, tend to be very, very self-promoting. So they would, write things like, a handsome, athletic male with a good sense of humor, So they would be much, much more self-promoting. Or likewise, for example, in Ukraine, that again kind of values modesty. You go to somebody's house, for example, if you have, if my family has guests, my mother would spend literally a whole day and sometimes 2 days preparing food. And the food is, believe me, it's good. It's really, really, really good, right? And then people would come and my mother would serve it with, words, oh, there is nothing special to offer you. This is not very delicious, but I hope you will like it. It's nothing special, things like it's not very good. And, people try to be as modest, as self-effacing as possible. And here in the United States, it's the opposite. People are very self-promoting. So you go to somebody's house and, they would buy that, cake powder that you just add water and put it in the oven for 15 minutes. And they would say, I baked this cake. Yes, of course you baked it because you didn't buy, a prepared one. But come on. And they would be very, proud and promoting and, bragging about their skills. So now this may sound like a funny, difference, but it actually can play out very, very importantly in job settings. Those things may determine who gets the job and who gets promoted. I'll give you another example from my own life. Again, when I was in Canada, I had a friend who had basically a no job. So he was working for a minimum wage. There was a little thing around the university. I don't want to get into, the whole details, so, don't want to identify the person. But anyway, he had a part-time job at a minimum wage, even though he had huge experience as an accountant. Moreover, not only he worked as an accountant in multiple countries before he ended up in Canada, he actually had Canadian, the general accountant certification, whatever they call it. And so we were talking about that one day, and he was saying, I'm puzzled. I don't know why I'm not getting a job. That was at the time in Calgary when unemployment was literally negative. There were more jobs than there were people. People would find jobs like literally out of high school, boom, next day job, college. I mean, easy. In fact, people would come from all around the country because the oil industry was booming at that time, and he couldn't find a job. And so at some point I had a quick look at his cover letter that he was attaching to his resume. And no surprise that he was having difficulties getting a job. He would say things like, I have some experience, I occasionally make mistakes, but I'm kind of a decent guy. Bad. I look at the cover letters written by my students. I mean, literally, they have no experience. They had like a 2-week internship last summer, and they would write extensive work experience, solid skills in this and that. And so when you are a recruiter and when you get a stack of those applications and you look through them and you see one, solid experience, lots of, and you look at the other one and it says, I sometimes make mistakes, I'm not a very, best employee, which one are you going to choose? I mean, so yes, you have to be more self-promoting because people may think that you're not qualified or that you lack initiative or that you lack interest or whatever the reasons, but you may be in trouble because of that. Now, training, that's another whole topic. So again, switching gears. First, training is a huge business. A lot of money is spent on employee training. And so here are just some of the things that I would like to point out. One, there are two main philosophies towards training. And so actually this table here illustrates the situation better. There is what we call the Asian model or even the European model, and there is the American model. The European model, and some countries in Asia use that as well, they rely on on-the-job training. So they rely on training employees at the expense of the company. For example, Germany and Japan are probably the best examples of this approach. In Germany, you have this whole system, probably the best in the world, of apprenticeship. People would go to like Fachschule, it's like a trade school after they graduate high school, and they would get an extra year or two of training, and that's it. So they would, like, for example, go to Realschule, right? It's like one of the high school types because they also have gymnasium. And so by the age of about 18 or so, they would graduate, and that's all the education they've received. And then they would get a job, let's say at Volkswagen, and they would have intensive training with the company. They would go from one position to another, learn. So they basically would be trained by the company to work for the company. And as a result, the company invests a lot in the person, but the person also owes a lot to the company, has a lot of company-specific knowledge, and so people would stick with the company for a good portion of their life or even for the whole life. Japan is actually, now it's a little changing, but it actually used to be that if you get hired by a company, you are there for life, like literally lifetime employment was the standard. And so most of the training you receive would be at the company. You may still go to college, no question about that. But again, most of the stuff that you use in your work, that's what you get from your company at the company expense. There would be big, training centers, apprenticeship centers, there would be apprenticeship programs on the job. So basically, company invests in you and you pay in return with good performance over many years. The American model is different. The American model is your education is your responsibility. So we don't want to invest in your education because we will pay for your education, train you, and then you will go to a different company. And there is some logic to that. Americans change job a lot. On average, it's something like 3 years in a job. Actually, it's much less because there are many people who work only for a few months in a given job, and then there is everybody else. So the mode is even less than 3 years, but the average is roughly 3 years in a job. And they say this number will drop even more. People will be switching jobs even more frequently. So obviously, if that's the tradition, if that's the culture, why would you want to invest a lot of money in a person who is likely to switch jobs once he gets or she gets that job? For example, some companies in the United States would pay for your master's degree. And in most cases, there would be a binding contract that if you get that master at the company's expense, starting maybe at nights, you are responsible to work for the company for extra 5 years, or otherwise you have to pay to the company for the cost of your education. They are afraid because they will invest in your education and you will go somewhere else. So the result in the United States model, it's up to the person to receive education. So you pay for it, you get a better job with it, but the company has nothing to do with it. The company shops for people based on their skills, they hire them, they work them, and then if the person happens to get more education during this period, the person just goes to a different company. In some cases promoted, but usually it's the best way to earn more money is just hop from one job to another. So likewise, when you look at this table here, it shows how many hours of training in the first 6 months are provided to an employee after the person is hired. And as you can see, there is a huge difference. So the United States on average provides only about 40 hours, which is like 1/10 of what the Japan provides. And that's because, things that I just described to you. Cross-cultural training, again, that's another topic or a special case of training. So when you deal with cross-cultural situations, when your employees have to work with foreigners, if you send them overseas, for example, or hire immigrant employees, in most cases you want to offer some sort of a training. And I've been to many of these training sessions, I run many of them myself. And here's what I have to say about it. Unfortunately, our cross-cultural training sucks. I'm sorry for using this very strong term, but we have a big problem with cross-cultural training. The reason for that is that in most cases, the trainers, the coaches, designed the training to be fun rather than useful, rather than effective. The thing is that when we design a training program, we want to achieve success at different levels. First, reactions. Kirkpatrick model, right? Reactions. You want people to be happy with what they, go through. You want them to enjoy it. Second, you want them to learn something. And this is different. Having fun is different from acquiring new information. Then you want them to change behavior. And again, it's different. Having fun is different from learning new stuff, but learning new stuff is different from actually changing behavior. Even if you now know you don't necessarily change the behavior, and that's what you want. And changing behavior is not necessarily going to lead to better performance. And even that better performance is not necessarily going to lead to higher profits for the company. And so when you run training, especially cross-cultural training, hardly ever do I see any sort of evaluation of its effectiveness. In most cases, it's designed to be fun, and you have all those, trust falls, and you have all those, games and things. But nobody really knows if they actually are helpful, in the sense that if they really teach people something new. In most cases, especially in cross-cultural training, the only lesson they provide is, well, people are different. So did you see, in this activity how different we looked at things? So people are different. So what? I mean, yes, it's kind of interesting, eye-opening, but so what? I mean, didn't we know that? We kind of knew that anyway. Are we going to now do things differently? I don't know. Are we going to now behave differently? Are we going to now perform better? Are we now, when we come back to work on Monday, are we going to make more money for the company? Maybe so, but the point is that nobody knows. I mean, I haven't really seen any good evaluation system in place for a cross-cultural training program. At the very best, there would be some sort of like a questionnaire. Did you enjoy it? Was the food good? Maybe, did you find it useful? But just because I say that I had fun, or, when you have that smiley face, just because I put smiley faces on each category, it doesn't really mean that I actually learned something. I mean, like in my test, like the course that you're now taking, I will have a test and I will ask you and I will see if you know. But again, at least I will know if you learned something or not. I may not necessarily know if you're going to change things or do things differently, but at least I do something, and it's not enough, obviously. So, but in cross-cultural training programs, they don't do even that. And if they don't do even that, we don't know if it works. And if we don't know what works, if it works, we cannot provide quality training, and that's a big problem. Vacations, there may be differences in legal requirements for vacations. Again, here is a list of how many vacation days are mandatory in different countries. And there is a huge difference. In the United States, it's only 16 days, and even that is kind of a stretch because more and more companies now hire you as contract employees to complete a particular job, and so there would be no vacation whatsoever because you're a contract employee for a particular job. Your job is to do this for a year, and I don't care about anything else. So there are ways around it. And you go to countries like Germany, and it's over a month a year. Again, huge difference, especially if you want to open a subsidiary there, because that's what you'll have to offer to your employees. Now, compensation is a big deal. And again, each of these topics I'm kind of moving quickly. I mean, people wrote dissertations on those. You can spend a whole career studying it. But anyway, here is another situation. Compensation. It seems like it's an easy task, but let me give you just one instance of when it's not so simple, and I wonder if you will know the answer. Again, it's not to say what's right and what's wrong, it's just to illustrate how challenging that sometimes could be. Imagine a situation that a company, let's say an American company, is hired to install some sort of equipment at a factory in, let's for example say Ukraine, and so they need 10 engineers to do this job. And so they place an ad and they receive a number of applications, and eventually they select 5 people from America and 5 people from Mexico. Equally qualified, all very good for the job. They go to Ukraine, they live in a hotel, and in a matter of a week, they assemble that system. And they get $10,000 paid for the job. And again, I'm using just round numbers to make it easier. Now the question is, how would you distribute the money among those people from Mexico and the United States? And so some people would say, oh, it's easy, everybody gets $1,000, or again, whatever the amount is. And others would say, no, that's a bad idea. I mean, $1,000 per a week of work overseas, it's nothing for Americans. I mean, that's not worth it. $1,000 for a guy from Mexico for a week of work. Woohoo, that's a lot, that's great. So we have to give Americans a little more because, they have a higher cost of living. But that is also not a very good solution, because then the Mexicans would say, wait a second, didn't we apply for the same job and were qualified equally to do it? Didn't we do the same job? Didn't we live in the same hotel, worked at the same, site? How come they get more than I get? I mean, who cares how much my house costs and how much your house costs? We did the same job, so shouldn't we be paid equally? And again, there is no easy way to solve this problem. The point here is that it's different from this perspective, challenging. And no matter what solution you make, it will not be perfect. Somebody will not be happy. Saying in face is another, big deal. So, providing feedback, saying no. In some cultures, like in the United States, it's a very normal thing. If you need to provide feedback and you're not happy with the person, just say them. In Asia, in Middle East, it's more about saving face. You never say openly, criticize people, especially in front of other employees. You have to always be very sensitive to their needs, to their, preferences, to their status in the organization. So defacing a person or, criticizing the person may not be, a very good policy, and you have to be sensitive about that. Again, it's a huge topic, could be, enough for a book, but, just giving it to you so you know that the problem exists. Attitudes towards justice is a big deal. In different cultures, people have different preferences for making decisions and what those decisions are. And so let's talk, for example, about what we call distributive justice. How do you distribute the rewards, or how do you distribute the punishments? In some cultures, it's what we call equity. So you work more, you get more. You work less, you get less. In other cultures, it's equality. Everybody should get the same, right? And if somebody gets more, people get very, very nervous about that. In some cultures, it's seniority. So older, more tenured people get more even if they worked less. Need-based. In some cultures, it's about the need. You have more kids, you have bigger families, so you should get more. Now, those things differ by culture, by country. Like, for example, in the United States, the vast majority of people prefer equity. So you eat what you kill. In Asia, yes, still more people prefer equity over anything else, but many more people, people are more comfortable there with equality compared to the United States. And so I'll just give you an example. I read this article in the 80s, that the story happened, and I read it in the 90s. So it was about an American company that was doing business in China. And they had a situation where two, again, employees from a team of about 10 did something very well. I don't remember what that was, but they, did something very well. And the management decided to reward them for their, performance, and so they bought them leather jackets as gifts. And at that time in China, a relatively poor country at that time, a leather jacket was a big deal. It's like, I don't know, probably an equivalent of a small car in a developed country these days. And so they thought that this would stimulate performance in the team, that would kind of motivate other employees to work harder. But they soon noticed that it didn't help, it actually hurt more. So they noticed that the rest of the team was kind of getting very agitated, very upset with the two who got the reward. And so eventually they learned that in that culture it was a better idea to single out some people and give them big rewards. So eventually they had to buy a leather jacket for everyone on the team, because otherwise it was leading to conflicts. So people were not used to this kind of differentiation. Seniority, same thing. You go to some Asian cultures and people higher up in the positions may not necessarily do more, but will definitely be getting more pay, better, dining services, better car, business car, whatever else. In other cultures like Northern Europe, it's much more egalitarian, so seniority doesn't give you much. Interestingly, in the United States, in some organizations, seniority matters as well. Like, for example, in unionized organizations like GM, you may be working on the same assembly line, doing exactly the same job at the same pace, but if you've been with the company longer, if you are more senior, have more tenure with the company, you will be literally getting a few dollars more per hour, just because that's the collective bargaining agreement they have. Well, likewise in schools, public schools, you may have, be teaching the same classes, same hours, same student satisfaction. But if you have masters, you will be getting more than those who don't. Just the rule, Need-based, again, in some cultures, people may be much more need-based oriented. I guess here it would be only observed, I don't know, maybe in some gang cultures, like gangs, like bands, criminal bands, we rob the bank and get caught, but I'm going to take the blame and save you because, you have family, kids, and, you will take care of my family while I will be in the prison. So that will kind of, be more need-based. Procedural justice. How do you arrive to a conclusion? Again, in some cultures, it's cooperative. We will talk it over together, and that seems to be very common in some European countries. People just, get together and discuss. Canada is very much like that. In some other cultures, it's directive. So the boss will tell us what to do, like Japan, for example. Yeah, we have the boss, and the boss will decide and announce the decision. It wouldn't work, by the way, very well in Canada or the United States. I mean, yes, the bosses get respect, but it would be perceived wrong to not consult employees. Finally, mediation. Again, third party will tell us. Again, like my lawyer will talk to your lawyer. In the United States, it's a big deal, like mediation, arbitration, legal, very, very common. Even like, in personal things, when people are getting divorced. Again, my lawyer will talk to your lawyer. I mean, if I were to get a divorce, I'm not planning to, but if I were, if I involved lawyers in that, my parents wouldn't understand. Like, can't you divide your car and the house among yourself? Why would you want to hire, lawyers to that? Expensive lawyers to do that. So again, but in other cultures, that's the only way. Like in the United States, there are so many lawyers. In fact, the highest lawyer per capita ratio. And just about any issue, there would be some sort of lawyers or mediators involved. Decision making, how people make decisions. Instead of talking about that, I'm going to add a video, TED Talk by Sheila. What's her last name? It's escaping me. But anyway, there is a very interesting 15-minute talk on cross-cultural differences in decision making. Fascinating. I highly recommend that you watch it after the video. Definitely worthwhile. I'm actually going to skip this slide here because that's based on the let me briefly talk about that. No, I'm going to skip it. You watch it. She talks about it much better. There is no need for me to repeat what she said. Reaction to injustice. So if something goes wrong, how do you decide what to do about it? Again, in some cultures, people are just, show loyalty. Yes, I'm not agreeing with the decision made by my boss, but I'm going to still basically shut up, suck it up, and hope that tomorrow will be a better day. In other cultures, people use neglect. So yes, the decision is unfair, I'm underpaid, so I'm just gonna stop working hard. I'll just do barely enough to justify my low pay. Some people use voice. I mean, they actively seek justice. They go on protest. They do something about it. And in some cultures, people use exit. So if I'm not happy, if the decision is not right, if I cannot do anything about it, I'm just going to leave and go to a different country. And there are differences here, again, cross-cultural differences. Americans, for example, are much likely to use voice or exit. And perhaps the reason for that is, I don't know, they may have not only the historic, the cultural tradition, but also more options, I guess. People from some other cultures, especially Asia, tend to use loyalty, and Europeans tend to use neglect. And, it's a very important cross-cultural difference. Here is a question, and let's see if you know the answer. It's like from 20 minutes ago, but hopefully you were paying attention. And the answer is A, equity. Finally, acculturation. So you go to a different country, and you adjust into a different country. And I actually did my dissertation on this topic. And so the person goes through stages of development. So this is what happens. And again, I wrote a whole paper a whole dissertation on that, and obviously I would need many hours to discuss it in details. But the bottom line is that when you relocate to a different country, you go through the adjustment stages. And so your first few weeks would be what we call a honeymoon. So that's the period when you like everything, new food, new architecture, new people, oh, that's so cool. Then in the next several weeks, you experience what we call the culture shock. Like, oops, what's going on? That police officer yelled at me, and my housing landlord was, not cooperative, and getting the driver's license was a big challenge. You get that culture shock. And then you go through a phase that we call disillusionment. That's when you kind of realize that the life in the new country is not as rosy, not as colorful as you thought it would be, and you're kind of like, oh man, maybe it was a bad idea to come here. And then you go through a stage of adjustment. Over time, you find ways to deal with the problem, and so you adjust. And then if you stay long enough, you may even go through what we call integration. That's when you become local. That's when your life becomes, part of that country, and you cannot imagine another life. So that's how it operates. Reverse culture shock. So you spend some time in the country, you get adjusted, and then you go home for, return home or go home for vacation. And in many cases you experience reverse culture shock. You become so Americanized, for example, or Canadianized. Then going back to Ukraine is actually a shock for you. All of a sudden, things that you were used to don't make sense to you anymore. And things that you used to do are not fun anymore, and friends are not friends anymore. And so you have that reverse culture shock, in many cases even stronger than the culture shock you experienced going to the to the foreign country. Because going to the foreign country, you expected differences. Going back home, you thought it would be like you remember, and turns out it's quite not the same. So it could be a problem. Finally, adaptation, adjustment, integration. In my dissertation, I guess I should say about that, just because, I know about it something. So I was trying to determine why people from some cultural groups are easier adjusting to new culture, have an easier time adjusting to new culture, and people from other cultures adjust much slower, and some of them never adjust fully. And so I was looking at a number of predictors, like, age at immigration, education, where people get all those things. And most of them came out just like expected. But there was one hypothesis that was very, very strongly supported, and so it was surprising. And that was frequency of the contact with the locals. And I looked at that both at the individual level, like literally how frequently you communicate, but also at the environment level. There are many people from your country in that location. And that was a very, very strong moderator. So over time, people kind of adjust, but it depends how quickly they adjust on that contact with the locals. And so my study found that if the locals constitute less than 15% of the people with whom you communicate on a regular basis. In other words, if you are in Canada, immigrated to Canada, and if people with whom you talk all the time, like your family members, your co-workers, your, buddies, if among those people less than 15% are Canadians, then there is a very good chance over time you will actually not become more Canadian, you will become less Canadian. So it may even reverse your acculturation. So the more you spend there, the less you actually will become Canadianized. The more sometimes even you can even show rejection towards your host culture. So you may not even, over time you may grow to like it less and less and less, and maybe even hate it. And so I didn't see many people like that, but there were a few, and that's very alarming. So if you have a person in a new culture who doesn't communicate, at least to some extent, with the locals, people may not only not integrate, they may actually reject that host culture. Anyway, here is what you need to know on the exam. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll see you next time.